In 636 AD, on the sun-baked plains of Al-Qadisiyyah in modern-day Iraq, an ancient superpower collided with a new, unified desert force. The Sassanid Imperial Army, directed by the Supreme Commander Rostam Farrukhzad, deployed tens of thousands of regular troops and elite cavalry to permanently halt the advancing Caliphate forces under Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. The Persian state possessed a colossal tactical advantage, fielding 33 living biological tanks, massive war elephants designed specifically to shatter enemy formations and trigger absolute panic among the Arab light cavalry. Yet, in a catastrophic reversal of military fortune, this ultimate weapon became the instrument of Sassanid ruin when the panicked beasts stampeded backward, fracturing the rigid imperial infantry lines from within. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we break down the 4-day battle of Al-Qadisiyyah, analyzing how a technologically and numerically superior empire was systematically dismantled by highly mobile light infantry, tactical adaptation, and a brutal shift in the weather. For 4 unbroken days, the conflict dragged across the dry canals, pushing both armies to the absolute brink of physical collapse. The Sassanid commanders relied heavily on traditional shock tactics, expecting their heavy armor to secure a rapid, decisive triumph. Instead, the Arab army absorbed the immense kinetic pressure, countering the elite Persian cataphracts with raw endurance, targeted strikes, and unmatched logistical flexibility. This engagement was not a simple border skirmish. It was a fundamental clash of military doctrines, pitting the immense weight of a 400-year-old dynasty against the lethal speed of a rapidly expanding power. The fate of the entire Near East hinged on the survival of the men fighting in the dust. The Persian Supreme Commander believed his heavy armor and living tanks guaranteed an absolute victory, but he had miscalculated the one factor he could not control: the environment itself. Long before the first arrow was loosed at Al-Qadisiyyah, the geopolitical foundation of the Near East had already cracked. To comprehend the fragility of the Sassanid Imperial Army in 636 AD, one must examine the devastating quarter-century conflict that immediately preceded it. From 602 to 628 AD, the Sassanid Empire and the Byzantine Empire engaged in a catastrophic war of mutual exhaustion. While this conflict ultimately preserved the borders of late antiquity, it systematically drained the Persian treasury, decimated their veteran officer class, and severely disrupted the agricultural tax base that funded their colossal military apparatus. The imperial government in Ctesiphon was a rigid, top-heavy administration that relied heavily on massive logistical trains and slow-moving hierarchies, making it structurally incapable of recovering quickly from decades of attritional warfare. Maintaining a heavy cavalry force required perfectly bred mounts, intricate scale armor, and years of dedicated training, all of which depended on an imperial economy that was now heavily fractured. This military exhaustion was fatally compounded by violent internal political instability. In the 4 years following the end of the Byzantine War, the Sassanid throne witnessed a chaotic succession of nearly a dozen different rulers, driven by assassinations and noble infighting. Civil war tore through the provinces, with powerful generals turning their private armies against one another rather than guarding the frontiers. By the time the young king Yazdegerd III finally secured the crown in 632 AD, the central government was practically paralyzed. The empire remained sprawling, heavily fortified, and culturally dominant, but its administrative core was hollowed out, leaving the vast southern desert frontiers dangerously undermanned and politically disconnected from the capital. While the Persian giants struggled to stand, an unprecedented geopolitical shift was occurring directly across its southern borders. The Arabian Peninsula, Historically viewed by the empires of the north as a barren expanse of fractured, warring tribes, had been rapidly unified under the banner of a new Islamic faith. This unification forged a fighting force unlike anything the Sassanid generals had ever faced. The Arab army, fighting for the newly established caliphate, was not burdened by the sprawling siege trains, heavy armor, or aristocratic hierarchies of traditional imperial forces. Relying on hardy camel trains and austere desert rations, the caliphate forces required only a fraction of the water and calories needed to sustain a Persian cataphract. They were highly motivated light infantry and cavalry, capable of executing rapid strategic maneuvers across punishing arid terrain where heavy Persian supply lines would inevitably stall. They did not advance by overwhelming numerical force. They conquered by weaponizing their unmatched operational speed and deep geographic adaptability. The Sassanid High Command, steeped in centuries of conventional warfare against other static empires, fundamentally misread this strategic equation. When the first Arab incursions began pressing into the fertile lands of Mesopotamia, the Persian governors dismissed them as isolated raiding parties looking for plunder, treating them as a border nuisance rather than a sovereign threat. They responded with localized, sluggish deployments that were easily outmaneuvered and destroyed by the highly mobile caliphate forces. By the time the supreme commander, Rostam Farrokhzad, realized that these were not mere raids, but a coordinated campaign of territorial conquest, the Arab vanguard had already secured vital bridgeheads across the Euphrates River network. The Sassanid imperial court recognized the border incursions too late, forcing them to mobilize a colossal, cumbersome army to defeat a threat they still fundamentally misunderstood. To counter the desert-born speed of their enemy, the Sassanid state deployed an army that functioned as a moving fortress. Under the command of Rostam, a pragmatic and highly experienced military governor, the imperial host numbered anywhere from 60,000 to 100,000 men. This vast force anchored its strength on the elite cataphracts, heavy cavalry completely encased in scale armor and designed to deliver a shattering kinetic impact. Every component of the Persian war machine relied on rigid formation and overwhelming mass to lock the enemy in place and grind them into the dirt. Opposing them was a caliphate force of approximately 30,000 men, led by the veteran commander Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. Stricken with a severe illness, Sa'd was unable to mount a horse or personally ride the lines. Instead, he commanded the entire engagement from a fortified structure overlooking the plains, relying on a highly efficient network of aides to relay his orders to the field. This physical separation did not fracture Arab discipline. Rather, it highlighted their flexible, decentralized command structure, which adapted rapidly to battlefield conditions, compared to the top-heavy Persian hierarchy. The visual disparity between the two forces perfectly encapsulated their opposing military doctrines. As the Sassanid formations locked into place, the blinding reflection of the scorching Mesopotamian sunlight off thousands of overlapping iron scales presented a stark contrast to the dust-covered, unarmored tunics of the Caliphate light infantry. The Arab forces lacked the sophisticated metallurgy of the empire, carrying simple spears, swords, and bows, and relying on rawhide shields rather than walls of iron. However, this lack of heavy equipment provided a lethal logistical advantage. The Caliphate forces could march rapidly, reposition instantly, and maintain their stamina over a multi-day engagement in the severe heat. They were strategically anchored to the deep desert at their backs, an environment that provided a secure supply line and an impassable barrier to any pursuing Persian heavy cavalry. Rostam understood that attempting to chase down Arab light cavalry with heavily armored cataphracts would only exhaust his mounts and leave his infantry flanks exposed. To neutralize the mobility of the Caliphate forces, the Supreme Commander deployed the ultimate biological shock weapon of late antiquity, 33 Indian war elephants. These beasts functioned as living siege engines, strategically distributed across the Persian front line. Each elephant carried a reinforced wooden litter housing elite archers and javelin throwers, allowing them to rain downward missile fire from an elevated, moving platform. But the true tactical value of the war elephant was not merely in its physical ability to trample infantry. It was a psychological and olfactory weapon designed specifically to dismantle enemy cavalry. Horses that have never been trained alongside elephants possess a deeply ingrained biological terror of their scent and sheer size. Rostam calculated that the mere advance of the beasts would induce absolute panic among the Arab mounts, causing the Caliphate flanks to dissolve before the Persian cataphracts even drew their swords. With the tactical pieces set, the immense logistical footprint of the Sassanid Empire halted on the eastern edge of the plains, drawing its battle lines near the protective barrier of the local canals. Across the dry terrain, the Arab forces organized into traditional tribal units, utilizing a skirmish doctrine that had proven highly effective in their recent border victories. They expected a conventional clash of cavalry charges and infantry lines, trusting in their superior endurance to outlast the heavily burdened imperial soldiers. As the two massive hosts finally arrayed against each other across the dry canals, the Arab cavalry prepared for a standard engagement, completely unaware of the towering nightmares hidden within the Persian ranks. The first day of Al-Qadisiyyah, known historically as the Day of Armath or the Day of Concussion, began not with a massive coordinated charge, but with the ancient Near Eastern tradition of single combat. Champions from both sides rode into the open space, separating the armies, engaging in brutal, individualized duels to establish psychological dominance. While the Arab champions secured several high-profile victories in these early skirmishes, Rostam remained detached and methodical. He was not interested in individual glory. He was carefully calculating the precise moment to leverage his overwhelming numerical and technological superiority. When the duels concluded, Rostam issued the order for a general advance. The Sassanid front line, a massive, rigid wall of overlapping shields and heavy infantry, began its slow, disciplined march forward across the arid plain, supported by the deep, rhythmic pounding of Persian war drums. Recognizing that the Caliphate's primary tactical advantage lay in their highly mobile light cavalry stationed on the wings, Rostam deployed his most devastating asset. The 33 Indian war elephants were driven forward, specifically directed at the Arab flanks. From a tactical standpoint, these beasts functioned as moving fortresses that dictated the geometry of the battlefield. Persian archers and javelin throwers, stationed in reinforced wooden litters atop the elephants, utilized their elevated platforms to rain downward missile fire into the lightly armored Arab ranks. This high-angle trajectory was lethal, effortlessly bypassing the standard frontal defenses of the Caliphate infantry and pinning them in place. However, the true devastation unleashed by the elephants was not the missile fire, but the uncontrollable biological reaction of the Arab horses. Cavalry doctrine dictates that the effectiveness of any mounted unit relies entirely on the discipline of the animal. The Arab horses had never encountered the immense size, the unnatural trumpeting, or the distinct, pungent scent of the Indian elephants. The reaction was instantaneous and catastrophic. Entire squadrons of Caliphate cavalry completely lost their cohesion. Horses bucked, reared, and scattered in absolute panic, violently throwing their riders and trampling their own infantry lines despite desperate commands to hold formation. In a matter of minutes, the protective cavalry screen on the Arab flanks effectively dissolved. Stripped of their mobility, The Caliphate riders were forced to fight on foot, leaving their infantry lines entirely exposed to the advancing Persian cataphracts. With their cavalry neutralized and fleeing the field, the structural integrity of the Caliphate army faced immediate collapse. The Arab infantry was forced to step forward and absorb the full kinetic impact of the Sassanid heavy advance. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, observing the disintegrating flanks from his fortified command post, issued rapid orders to his elite tribal contingents to stabilize the line. The Arab foot soldiers locked their rawhide shields and braced their spears, relying on raw, localized unit discipline to halt the massive Sassanid push. They fought a desperate, static action, absorbing heavy casualties as they used concentrated archery to target the Persian elephant drivers and the unprotected eyes of the beasts, attempting to bleed the momentum of the Sassanid armor. The engagement rapidly devolved into a horrific, grinding contest of attrition. The Sassanid heavy infantry and cataphracts pressed their advantage, utilizing their superior armor to methodically push the Caliphate forces backward toward the canals. The Arab lines bent severely under the weight of the elephants, but through sheer physical endurance and rapid redeployment of reserves, they refused to shatter completely. The Persian advance, while devastating, was physically exhausting. The heavily armored cataphracts began to suffer under the intense heat of the Mesopotamian afternoon, preventing them from fully exploiting the gaps in the Arab defense. This brutal stalemate dragged on for hours, pushing the limits of human endurance until the fading light finally forced both armies to disengage and pull back to their respective encampments. The Arab forces barely survived the first sunset, but as they tended to their wounded in the dark, they knew the elephants would return at dawn, and spear walls alone could not stop them twice. The dawn of the second day, known in the historical record as the Day of Agwath or the Day of Succor, broke over a Caliphate army that was bruised but structurally intact. The most critical development of the morning was not a battlefield maneuver, but a profound logistical triumph. On the horizon, the arrival of reinforcements from the Syrian front rapidly shifted the tactical balance of power. Commanded by the veteran tactician Al-Qadisiyyah ibn Amr, these fresh troops had recently campaigned against the Byzantine Empire and possessed high combat discipline. Rather than deploying them in a single mass, Al-Qadisiyyah executed a calculated psychological stratagem. He divided his forces into small squadrons, ordering them to arrive on the battlefield in a continuous, staggered sequence throughout the day. This steady influx created the illusion of an inexhaustible stream of reserves, simultaneously boosting Arab morale and demoralizing the Sassanid commanders who watched the enemy lines constantly replenish. When the Sassanid formations deployed across the plain to renew the offensive, a glaring absence fundamentally altered the battlefield geometry. The 33 Sassanid war elephants were missing from the front lines. The brutal, close-quarters infantry fighting and targeted Arab archery of the previous day had inflicted severe damage on the wooden litters, the securing straps, and the beasts themselves. Rostam's engineers required the entirety of the second day to repair the shattered howdahs and tend to the wounded animals. Without their living siege engines available to shatter the Arab flanks, the Persian supreme commander was forced to rely entirely on his conventional military assets. The engagement temporarily reverted to a traditional contest between the heavily armored Sassanid cataphracts and the highly mobile Arab light forces. Recognizing that the Persian heavy cavalry would immediately attempt to exploit the gaps left by the previous day's combat, the Arab commanders executed a brilliant improvisation. Al-Qadisiyyah understood the exact psychological mechanics that had nearly destroyed his own cavalry on day one. If unfamiliar beasts could break the discipline of Arab horses, they could do exactly the same to the Persians. Stripping their rear supply lines, the Caliphate troops repurposed their logistical camels into weapons of psychological warfare. They draped the towering pack animals in dark, flowing cloths and attached wide palm fronds to their heads and necks, creating alien, monstrous silhouettes that defied the visual conditioning of any imperial cavalry mount. As the Persian heavy cavalry initiated their disciplined, massed charge, the Arab forces drove these disguised camels directly toward the advancing cataphracts. The tactical result perfectly mirrored the disaster of the previous day, but in reverse. The Sassanid war horses, specifically bred and trained for the metallic clash of armor and the rigid geometry of standard formations, completely lost their nerve at the sight and smell of these bizarre shapes. The battlefield erupted with the chaotic sound of heavy Persian war horses neighing and violently bucking in terror, throwing their heavily armored riders into the dry dirt. Deprived of their mounts, the elite Persian horsemen were suddenly grounded, weighed down by thick scale armor that turned their intended shock mobility into a fatal liability. With the Sassanid cavalry effectively neutralized by their own panicked mounts, the Caliphate light cavalry was free to maneuver, violently harrying the Persian flanks and forcing the imperial infantry into a rigid, static defensive posture. The fighting devolved into a grueling multi-hour slog under the severe heat of the Mesopotamian sun. Sassanid foot soldiers, though lacking the momentum of their cataphracts and elephants, maintained their deeply ingrained shield walls, utilizing their superior bronze and iron equipment to prevent a total Arab breakthrough. The plain of Al-Qadisiyyah transformed into a grinding stalemate of thrusting spears and parried sword strikes, a pure test of physical endurance where neither side could generate the decisive shock required to break the opposing center. As dusk approached, the combatants slowly disengaged, pulling back to their respective encampments to recover their wounded. The Caliphate forces had successfully survived the grueling attrition, utilizing clever tactical adaptation to level the playing field against an imperial superpower. The second day ended in a bloody stalemate, but the Persian engineers spent the night working frantically to repair the elephant litters, preparing to unleash their heavy armor one final time. On the morning of the third day, historically recorded as the Day of Amas, or the Day of Hardship, the tactical equilibrium achieved by the Arab forces was violently erased. Throughout the night, Sassanid engineers had successfully repaired the shattered wooden litters and re-equipped their biological shock units. The 33 Indian war elephants returned to the field, but Rostam adjusted his deployment, advancing them with a tightly packed escort of heavy infantry to prevent the Caliphate cavalry from repeating their disruptive maneuvers. As this combined arms juggernaut struck the Arab center, the sheer physical pressure threatened to fracture the Caliphate army in half. Arab spear walls that had held firmly the previous day began to buckle under the renewed, synchronized assault of armored beasts and pressing cataphracts. The Persian heavy cavalry exploited the momentum of the elephants, driving deep wedges into the Caliphate lines and isolating entire tribal contingents. Observing the imminent collapse of his front lines from his elevated command post, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas realized that a static defense was no longer viable. Despite his severe illness, the Arab Supreme Commander maintained absolute operational awareness. He recognized that the Persian elephants had to be permanently removed from the strategic equation, and that conventional archery was insufficient to halt their advance. He dispatched fast-riding aides with a highly specific, desperate directive to the veteran infantry of the Banu Tamim and Banu Asad tribes. They were ordered to abandon their defensive posture and launch a targeted counter-assault against the two alpha elephants. These specific beasts, distinguished by their massive size and distinct markings, dictated the movement of the entire herd. The command was analytical and precise. The Arab infantry was to blind the alphas and sever their trunks, systematically stripping the animals of their sensory navigation and their primary means of attack. Executing this order required an extraordinary display of tactical discipline and physical courage. The Arab light infantry had to sprint across the heavily contested ground, evading the lethal barrage of arrows and heavy javelins raining down from the elevated Persian litters. They had to slip directly past the interlocking shields and thrusting spears of the Sassanid infantry screen, risking immediate encirclement. Once underneath the towering animals, the unarmored soldiers utilized their speed to dodge the lethal footfalls and the sweeping blows of the elephants. In a highly coordinated strike, the Arab veterans drove their long spears deep into the eyes of the led beasts, while simultaneously swinging their heavy swords to sever the thick muscle of their trunks. The battlefield was instantly marked by the deafening, agonizing shrieks of the mutilated animals, a jarring resonance that cut cleanly through the continuous din of thousands of fighting men. What followed was a masterclass in the cascading consequences of biological warfare. An elephant in severe pain cannot be commanded by a human rider. Stripped of their vision, bleeding profusely, and completely disoriented, the two alpha beasts lost all combat conditioning. Ignoring the frantic commands and sharp iron hooks of their Persian mahouts, the blinded elephants spun violently around in a desperate bid to escape the source of their torment. This natural survival instinct immediately transformed the Sassanid Empire's greatest tactical asset into its most destructive liability. The immense kinetic energy that had been pushing the Arab lines backward was now redirected straight into the heart of the imperial army. Because Rostam had deployed his heavy infantry in a dense, rigid formation specifically to protect the beasts, the panicked reversal triggered a catastrophic structural failure within the Persian lines. The stampeding alphas plowed directly into the tightly packed Sassanid ranks, bringing thousands of pounds of immense weight down upon their own cataphracts and trampling hundreds of regular infantrymen into the dirt. The rigid geometry of the Persian shield wall, designed to repel frontal cavalry charges, offered absolutely no defense against an internal stampede of this magnitude. Seeing their alphas flee in blind panic, the remaining elephants broke their conditioning and blindly followed, tearing massive, uncontrollable gaps through the Sassanid center as they fled toward the river. The Arab infantry immediately surged forward into the localized chaos, exploiting the ruptured formations to inflict severe casualties on the disorganized and terrified imperial troops. The Persian lines had been fractured by their own ultimate weapon, but as the sun set on the third day, the exhaustion of both armies was absolute and the environment was about to deliver the final blow. The sunset of the third day brought no reprieve. Instead of withdrawing to their camps, the exhausted armies locked into a continuous, brutal nocturnal melee known to history as the Night of Snarl. In the pitch black of the Mesopotamian plain, unit cohesion completely evaporated. The rigid, highly structured command hierarchies of the Sassanid Empire were rendered useless, as generals could not see their banners and orders could not be heard over the din of close-quarters combat. Even Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, isolated in his observation post, lost all tactical control over his tribal contingents. The battle devolved into thousands of isolated, desperate skirmishes fought entirely by instinct and physical endurance, pushing men on both sides beyond the limits of human stamina. When dawn finally broke on the fourth day, the combatants were barely able to lift their weapons. But the decisive factor of the battle was no longer human. A severe shamal, a fierce and sustained desert sandstorm, swept violently across the plains of Al-Qadisiyyah. Crucially, the prevailing winds blew directly from the west, driving a blinding wall of abrasive dust straight into the faces of the Sassanid army. The environment itself had entered the tactical equation, acting as a massive force multiplier for the Caliphate troops while systematically stripping the Persian forces of their remaining military advantages. the immediate impact of the sandstorm on Sassanid doctrine was catastrophic. Persian military supremacy relied heavily on coordinated archery and rigid infantry formations guided by visual signals. The dense clouds of driving sand reduced visibility to mere feet, rendering the towering Sassanid standards invisible and breaking the visual chain of command. Archery became entirely ineffective as the gale force winds blew arrows off course or directly back toward the Persian lines. Furthermore, the elite Sassanid cataphracts found their heavy iron scale armor transformed into a lethal trap. As the fine dust infiltrated their helmets and coated their lungs, the already exhausted heavy cavalry began to asphyxiate under their own protection. Conversely, the Arab forces were biologically and culturally adapted to this precise environmental hostility. Operating with the heavy wind at their backs, the Caliphate light infantry did not suffer the blinding grit in their eyes. Their unarmored, loose-fitting tunics allowed them to move fluidly through the dust without the extreme heat retention that was crippling their enemies. Recognizing that the Persian defensive lines were completely blind and disjointed, the Arab commanders exploited the zero visibility conditions to launch a series of highly aggressive, localized thrusts. They weaponized the weather event as a natural screen, allowing their light infantry to close the distance without absorbing the lethal missile fire that had decimated them on the first day. Capitalizing on the disintegrating Sassanid center, a specialized Arab vanguard initiated a deep, penetrating strike. Navigating through the choking dust, these veteran fighters bypassed the fragmented Persian shield walls, systematically cutting through isolated pockets of heavy infantry. Their objective was not a general rout, but the physical location of the Sassanid command canopy. Because the Persian army was organized around a top-heavy, hyper-centralized command structure, the entire defensive network relied upon the survival and direction of Rostam Farrakhzad. If the supreme commander could be eliminated, the localized confusion caused by the sandstorm would instantly metastasize into an army-wide collapse. The vanguard successfully punched through the final rings of the Persian guard, reaching the command tent just as the wind reached its peak. The exact mechanics of Rostam's death remain clouded by the chaos of the environment. Historical accounts suggest he was either killed in the desperate, close-quarters melee as the canopy collapsed, or cut down in the mud while attempting to retreat across the shallow waters of the Atik Canal. Regardless of the specific physical strike, the tactical result was absolute. The supreme commander of the Sassanid expeditionary force was dead. Without a designated successor on the field and entirely stripped of visual communication by the relentless dust, the Persian chain of command was instantly and permanently severed. The localized loss of a general rapidly became a strategic disaster as the news rippled through the blinded ranks. Unable to receive orders, coordinate a counterattack, or even see their adjacent units, the remaining Sassanid officers lost all control over their terrified men. The rigid discipline that had sustained the empire for 4 centuries finally snapped under the unbearable combination of physical exhaustion, environmental asphyxiation, and the sudden vacuum of leadership. With their supreme commander dead in the mud and their vision choked by the sand, the mighty Sassanid host did what they had never done before. They broke. In ancient military engagements, the vast majority of casualties are rarely inflicted during the organized clash of formations. They occur during the chaotic collapse of a rout, when unit cohesion dissolves, and soldiers turn their backs to flee. As the confirmation of Rostam's death rippled through the blinded, choking Sassanid ranks, the remaining officers completely lost control over their contingents. The Persian military doctrine was strictly designed for forward momentum and rigid, overlapping shield walls. It possessed no flexible mechanism for executing a fighting retreat without central coordination. Without a designated second-in-command to establish a disciplined rearguard, the imperial army fractured into thousands of isolated individuals driven entirely by the raw instinct to survive. The once impenetrable Persian front dissolved into a disorganized mass surging eastward, desperate to put distance between themselves and the Caliphate light infantry. The Arab commanders immediately capitalized on this structural collapse, unleashing their reorganized light cavalry to run down the fragmented imperial units. In this desperate foot race, the defining technological advantage of the Sassanid military, their heavy iron scale armor, transformed into a fatal burden. Exhausted from 4 days of continuous, brutal combat and physically suffocating under the thick dust of the Shamal, the heavily armored Persian infantry and dismounted cataphracts simply could not outpace their lightly equipped pursuers. The Arab forces, hardened by desert mobility and unencumbered by heavy metal plates, systematically dismantled the retreating columns. They executed rapid, localized maneuvers to encircle and cut down fleeing soldiers who were too physically drained to raise their weapons or maintain their pace. This frantic withdrawal funneled the remnants of the Sassanid host directly toward the steep banks of the Atik Canal, a geographical obstacle that effectively sealed their destruction. The few established crossing points and narrow pontoon bridges were instantly choked by the sheer volume of fleeing troops. Panic quickly overrode basic military discipline as thousands of armored men violently compressed against the water's edge, pushed forward into the current by the kinetic weight of their terrified comrades pressing from behind. Attempting to swim the deep, fast-moving channels, hundreds of elite Persian cataphracts were dragged beneath the churning surface, their magnificent iron protection acting as an inescapable anchor in the dark water. Those who hesitated on the muddy, unstable banks were pinned against the canal by the advancing Arab vanguard, leaving them absolutely no room to maneuver, regroup, or form a final defensive square. By the time the Caliphate commanders finally halted the pursuit, the Sassanid expeditionary force had been entirely erased as a functioning military entity. While exact casualty figures from antiquity remain difficult to verify, historical estimates suggest that tens of thousands of imperial troops, alongside the irreplaceable core of the Persian veteran officer class, perished in the dust and water of the plains. The Arab army had not merely won a localized tactical engagement. Through extreme endurance and environmental exploitation, they had systematically dismantled the primary defensive apparatus of a global superpower. The battle was over, but the geopolitical shockwave of this single defeat would shatter an empire that had ruled for over 4 centuries. The destruction of the Sassanid field army at Al-Qadisiyyah was not merely a catastrophic loss of personnel. It represented the total, systemic failure of an entire military doctrine. For centuries, the Persian state had successfully relied on overwhelming mass, rigid infantry formations, and the devastating kinetic impact of heavy iron cataphracts to project imperial authority across the Near East. However, the 4-day engagement proved definitively that extreme operational mobility, highly motivated light infantry, and the strategic exploitation of hostile environments could systematically dismantle static, heavily burdened forces. The Caliphate army did not match Sassanid steel with steel. They utilized raw endurance and environmental adaptation to turn the empire's greatest assets into fatal liabilities. As the relentless desert wind finally settled over the plains, the mechanical thunder of the Persian war machine was replaced by an absolute, devastating silence that signaled the end of an era. With their primary defensive apparatus eradicated in the dust, the geographic shield protecting the Persian heartland instantly vanished. The strategic consequences of Al-Qadisiyyah materialized with terrifying speed. Within months of the victory, The Caliphate forces marched nearly uncontested to the towering gates of Ctesiphon, the sprawling, opulent capital of the Sassanid Empire. Stripped of his military protection, King Yazdegerd III was forced to abandon his ancestral seat of power, fleeing eastward into the Zagros Mountains with the shattered remnants of his court. The imperial treasury, a vast accumulation of wealth, gathered over 400 years of continuous dynastic rule, fell entirely into Arab hands. This monumental capture instantly transferred the financial and political gravity of the ancient world to the rising Islamic Caliphate, providing the economic engine required to fund further rapid territorial expansion. The battle did not simply redraw a disputed border, it effectively erased a global superpower from the map. The Sassanid Empire, a titan that had successfully rivaled Rome and Byzantium for generations, never recovered from the loss of its veteran officer class and central administration. The subsequent total collapse of the dynasty fundamentally altered the political, linguistic, and religious fabric of the entire region, leading to the permanent integration of the Persian territories into the Islamic world. Al-Qadisiyyah stands as a definitive historical marker, an enduring testament to the reality that even the most heavily armored and deeply entrenched empires can be unmade in a matter of days when confronted by an enemy that understands how to weaponize speed, discipline, and the unforgiving earth itself. Subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together, and join us for the next episode of World Chronicles.